Okay, thank you for joining. So I think we will start, and we'll allow more people to join as we get going. So welcome. My name is Hed Kovetz. I'm the CEO and one of the founders at Silverfort. And today we're going to talk about implementing identity security controls on legacy OT systems. I have a great guest here today, which I'm very happy to share this webinar with. Stuart. Stuart, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Stuart Okin. I'm the Deputy Director at Ofgem, responsible for cyber regulation within the critical national infrastructure for downstream gas and electricity.
Great. It's great to have you here today. And I think, Stuart obviously can share a lot about what companies are seeing in this space, what are the requirements, and then we'll talk about how can companies actually address those requirements. So Stuart, I'll let you start.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody on the call, and thank you for your time today, and especially thank you to Hed and the Silverfort team for raising the topic of identity within operational technology or OT environments. I'm going to take a strange approach and not introduce my background at this stage. Most people do at the beginning, but I'm just going to say a little bit more about my background later on. The reason for this is that I am personally less important than the actual role that I sit in. At Ofgem, the energy regulator, I'm responsible for cyber resilience regulation for downstream gas and electricity in the UK. Also, as a hobby, I'm also responsible for internally the digital technology within Ofgem. So this role affords me a unique understanding of the current position of cyber in the energy sector, which of course, given that this is critical national infrastructure, I'm unable to share with you. But I can share some general insights, which hopefully will create discussion during today's session. A quick journey. I only have a few slides as I want to take you on a quick journey through the context to insight, so we can move quickly to the Q&A. I also believe, unless you are paid as a stand-up comedian, one should limit personal airtime to the very minimum. So, context. The Network and Information System Regulation, also known as NIS, which is, by the way, this document here, probably can't see it very much, came into power in 2018, which was matched across the whole of Europe. Interestingly, there is very little mention of cyber within the regulation. In essence, the regulation is the legal instrument that governments across Europe, through, in our case in the UK, regulators such as us, ensure that operators of essential services within the UK's critical national infrastructure are putting in place the right measures to protect us. The regulation is focused on air transport, critical ground transport, key digital components such as DNS routes, water, and I believe the most important, energy. Why is energy so important? Well, without it, we lose heat, power, internet, manufacturing, trains, traffic lights, most landlines, because people don't realize that the PBX has gone and it's actually been replaced by the internet, and mobile phones communication. So again, most people don't realize, but in the UK, most mobile masts have a maximum of a 10-minute uptime before they lose power. And without that, we are really back in the dark ages. Without that energy, society moves to essentially what's called a local community-based resilience plan, which is euphemistically way of saying stay put and help your neighbours. We have seen this play out, actually, in the physical outages. Just recently, a few weeks ago in Shetland, where through icing, they lost their entire network on the island. So we have seen this played out, and we know what the consequences are like. But in an urban environment, it would be catastrophic. At the heart of the 40-page NIS document, save those folk who are not relevant to this area, it's pretty simple. There's sort of 4 clauses that are really quite important. 10.1, an operator of essential services must take appropriate and proportionate technical and organizational measures to manage risks around the scope of the systems underpinning their essential services. And my favorite, 10.4, an operator of essential services must have regard to the guidelines from the competent authority, which for energy is jointly held between the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, i.e. BEIS, and of course us at Ofgem. So the operator of essential services must have regard to what we send out. Obviously, the regulation lays out the requirements to notify us if there is an incident, and of course our right to enforce and penalise, that's issue fines, to those that are not taking appropriate and proportionate measures. Actually, let me digress a little bit. Who is Ofgem? Who are we? We are a non-ministerial, so we don't have ministerial oversight, and therefore an independent government department who protects the interests of consumers, which in the UK is the consumers are defined as both citizens and businesses. As you can see from the diagram, our scope is from generation through to transmission to the endpoint for gas and electricity. In summary, we make sure that companies remain honest. In addition, we also run many of the energy schemes in the UK. And this is part of my other role, as I said, looking after digital infrastructure. These schemes include things like boiler upgrade schemes, green tariff schemes, and we distribute about £10 billion a year. How do we achieve our mission? So, how do we basically get to do what we're doing? There are two approaches. One, enforcement and penalties, the stick, if you like. For example, we fined companies over £10 million for outages caused by storm harming a couple of years ago, as they had not put in place the provisions to protect the security of the supply or indeed respond appropriately. I should point out, for cyber, our intention is not to publicise enforcement actions. So when we enforce and when we penalise, we don't publicise until after remediation has been taken place for a company, subject to those penalties, as we do not want to paint a target on the critical national infrastructure organisation. The second, which is not widely understood by the public, but it's all in the public domain, many of the regulated companies are subject to what's called price control. And for those that are in the UK, you'll hear this talked about quite a bit. They will talk about the price cap, and that's part of the price control. They have to submit their investment and operational plans, usually once every couple of years. It's for a 5-year plan. It's a rolling 5 years, which are assessed by Ofgem and then approved. This includes cyber, which my department reviews. So that's, if you like, the carrot, the investment. So we approve the investment side of the companies subject to RIO. Therefore, we achieve our mission by supporting cyber investments and taking enforcement action should an operator of essential service not implement appropriate risk measures. Where does my team fit in? So we basically write the rules around how we regulate the companies, some of which are in the public domain on our website. I've got the links there. These rules include when companies report assessments, how we inspect, enforce, and penalise. In conjunction with NCSC, we develop associated technical standards for assurance and investment. We also recommend to our board the allocation investment, as I said earlier on, to many of these companies running the energy systems, basically similar to a bank agreeing the funds to manage these companies' cash flow. Okay, now for my introduction. In the last 4 years, I've reflected often how I found myself at Ofgem, writing cyber compliance frameworks and approving cyber investments for energy companies. I started off as a humble programmer in EDS, now HP, COBOL on mainframes, although always with an eye on implementing these new fangled IBM XT80 personal computers, as they were providing mainframe access while offering the first exciting productivity tools. Inevitably, I moved to Microsoft when they were working out of a tiny office in Reading. Each of us engineers given a fistful of floppies, trying to persuade organizations to implement PCs and networks. My development experience led me to customizing the Logongina, Control-Alt-Delete, for the first versions of Windows in order to attract skeptical companies to buy commercial software. But I think the most interesting time while I was at Microsoft was when I was within the Windows team in Redmond, attempting to educate developers on secure coding. I was lucky enough to finish there as Chief Security Advisor, and I think in part because I was in the middle of a cultural change, but probably I got that sort of role because I was mostly able to take a good beating from upset customers who had succumbed to cyber outages. What is astonishing is that what I saw 20 years ago at Microsoft is playing out today in the operational technology market. Vendors are not always implementing security in their products, attempting to sell additional security elements to companies providing critical infrastructure rather than embedding it, and then providing support for monitoring and maintaining the OT digital environment. My team is split into three, although folk tend to sort of drift between the two of them. The engagement team works closely with the companies to track improvement progress. The assurance team that conducts inspections, and the guidance team that publishes the standards, research, as well as guidance. Every energy company produces self-assessment returns twice a year using NCSC's cyber assessment framework, and we conduct inspections. For those not familiar with the cyber assessment framework, CAF, it describes 39 outcomes against 14 principles, including, and this is important, and risk interpretation indications of good practice. Okay, here's an exam question. What do we get if we receive all companies' self-assessments with improvement plans, inspection findings, and regular improvement tracking engagements? What do we get if we get all of those? Cyber assessments, cyber improvement plans, and inspection findings. What we get is really good situation awareness. So what are we seeing out there? The control awareness is not enough to really understand the risk position. You need to have intelligence and an understanding of system component processes and human vulnerabilities. Within the UK, the technical authority, NCSC, which I should have said earlier, is part of GCHQ, we've seen successful attacks such as those in Ukraine in December 2015, which was, by the way, most people don't realize was a multi-pronged attack against their grid, which resulted not only in the 230,000 customers losing power for up to 6 hours, but also they did a denial of service attack, preventing communication between the suppliers and consumers. I think for most of us, we're surprised today that Russia has not launched any cyber attacks during this war. Our usage is also changing, with EV sales for the first time outperforming diesel last year. Our patterns will also change, with more aggregators and load balancers coming into the market, and consumers becoming more price sensitive than ever, with the potential of them being able to choose different suppliers for their energy needs, such as a supplier that would charge their car and a different supplier for their house. With all these changes, companies are also going on a digital revolution so that they can track the energy electron or molecule through their system in order to offer more dynamic energy services and drive towards the net zero paradigm. Okay, so what do we get if we have a control situation awareness plus increased threats and the rising importance of digital systems? Yep, board attention. And I find myself in a situation where I'm talking to the boards of these companies as well as their chief executives on a regular basis. When the regulation was first introduced, our focus, apart from building a team, which we did quite quickly, was to encourage companies to consider the basics: governance and risk management, as well as understanding and documenting their most important network and information system assets and how they digitally relate to each other. This was harder than we initially thought, as companies' systems were often old and flat, nothing like this ideal Purdue model that you can see on the screen. I think basically systems, it all stems from a sort of engineering mindset. You know, engineers build simple and flat and basically to last systems that don't change. Basically, it's light. As long as the light is on and green and it has a fresh coat of paint, all is good. Safety is in the heart of energy OT systems, which is constantly reinforced through the no-touch approach. For good safety reasons, if you ever do a site visit, it's a hard hat, high-vis jacket, reinforced boots, and above all, hands in pockets. The mindset is great for maximum uptime, however, not so good for a digital environment running a flexible system landscape. So it's hard for companies with OT to think about risk as ever-changing, requiring a deep understanding of the digital systems they have and the daily emerging threats. Scope is often a challenge for companies. Let me give you an example. The gas control systems, which maintains pressure at the extremities. Should this be included within scope? An outage of this gas control system would only affect a small number of consumers. So in theory, no. But a cyber attack could affect the safety systems beyond the mechanical's ability to respond effectively. Therefore, a greater number of consumers could be affected on that pressure. So now we're not so sure whether this should be out of scope. The good news is the energy sector is accelerated very quickly in this space. But cyber resilience recovery capability, especially considering the geopolitical landscape and the need to grow expertise, is becoming more important than ever. Control focus. So let's move there. We are now in the control focus phase. We're kind of moving out of the governance and risk, understanding our assets, but we're moving into that control focus phase. If a company has a good handle on their assets, irrespective of whether they have plans to re-architect or not, then access is quickly raised as a priority. Who has access? When do they need access? And from where? The controls around this, with the associated monitoring, becomes vital. For identity within OT, there are some very specific guidelines that we've published, and indeed NCSE have published. And I've pulled those some key points. Lower trust access is a big concern, as we've seen attacks traverse from the enterprise IT systems to OT systems. Maintaining clear separation between these domains, which means special consideration is required in segmenting identity and authentication systems. In addition, key workstations, HMIs, applications, and system processes would ideally have additional controls such as multi-factor authentication to access. Questions will get raised around third-party access, potentially through the use of privileged access workstations, the use of enterprise directories, and how the whole system could work in island mode. However, for most legacy OT systems, these kind of controls are not available. So the main question for me is, how do we influence the supply chain, GE, ABB, Honeywell, etc., to embed controls such as identity into their solutions? That's it. Thank you for your time. I'm going to hand back to Head.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Great overview. And now we want to talk a little bit about how can these environments actually be protected. How can we actually apply security in these OT environments, especially when they're in island mode or air-gapped? So, Stuart, if you can unshare your screen, then I will share a few slides. And then after that, we will do some Q&A. So everyone, feel free, if you already have any questions, feel free to already ask them in the chat, in the Q&A section. So Stuart provided a great overview of some of the challenges, what are the requirements, but as we all know, achieving secure authentication and identity and access controls in these environments is technically complex. So let's discuss some of the solutions available and how do we extend them to these environments. As I'm sure you all know, there are many great identity security solutions out there. Things like Azure AD, Okta, Ping, Duo. We actually partner with all of them. They do a great job at providing identity and access security for modern environments, modern applications, cloud applications, corporate networks. But when it comes to critical infrastructure, these solutions simply cannot operate because these systems are usually stuck with legacy authentication. So think about things like legacy systems or command line interfaces, non-human identities, things like service accounts that are doing machine-to-machine access, protocols that ransomware is using to spread in the network. And of course, OT environments that are air-gapped or in island mode, where you can't even talk to the internet in order to call multi-factor authentication or any regular security control that usually is applied to identity protection. This is a big security gap. Of course, it's also a barrier for compliance with regulations, just like NIS, as well as cyber insurance requirements. So a lot of regulators, just like in the UK, and a lot of cyber insurance companies are starting to require these kind of security controls because the risk is just too high. Why are these systems so important? All these legacy systems and protocols that exist in these environments. It's not only because they are left exposed, it's also because attackers know that and they take advantage of that. So within these networks, attackers actually bypass any existing solutions because they know that these older protocols or systems are unprotected. So even if companies do implement multi-factor authentication or access control for some of their modern applications and protocols, attackers get to choose which protocol they are using. So if there is protection on a modern protocol, the attacker will simply use an older one or go to an older system that is not protected. Let's give an example, an attack on critical infrastructure that was pretty well known about a year ago, a little more, on Colonial Pipeline. In that case, attackers got into the network, which eventually will happen, right? We have to assume that at some point attackers will find a way into one endpoint in any network. But that's not a big issue by itself. If it's just one endpoint and that's it, if it stopped there, then the damage is pretty small. The problem is that from that point, attackers are always successful at moving laterally and expanding in the network. And the way they do that is always using these older protocols, command line tools, remote desktop, legacy systems, because they know that these systems, especially in OT environments, but even in IT environments, cannot be protected. And from that point, they can access anything. They can access network shares, they can access critical systems, they can encrypt everything. And that's how ransomware becomes a big problem when it moves from the initial endpoint, from the patient zero endpoint into the entire network. Now, if this happens with these kind of protocols, how do we enable secure authentication and access in these situations, for these systems, in these environments? So what we introduced today, and I want to explain to you as a new concept, is something called unified identity protection. The idea here is, instead of building secure authentication into the system, into the legacy or the OT system, we want to enforce it in the backend, because we cannot change these systems, right? I think we all know this. We're talking about systems that are either technically difficult to modify, or we're just not allowed to, because we will lose the warranty on this equipment. We have some very large companies in critical infrastructure as customers that are telling us we just cannot touch the systems, no matter what. So the idea is, let's add secure authentication and access without modifying the system, by sitting behind the legacy identity infrastructure. Meaning that the OT or the legacy system still believes that it's using a legacy protocol. But in fact, we are now sitting behind that legacy identity solution, adding modern security. This means that we can add multi-factor authentication to resources that couldn't be protected before, legacy systems, OT systems, and things that are just not web-based. This also means that this can operate in island mode, in OT, air-gapped environment where there's just no internet connectivity. So this solution can actually be deployed in these situations, and of course in the cloud as well, if this is also part of the environment. Another advantage is that this approach works not only for humans, it works even for non-human authentication, service accounts, machine-to-machine access. Anyone who's gone through a red team assessment, or hopefully not, but an actual data breach, knows that attackers tend to go for these accounts, these non-human identities. They're just very vulnerable, they have a lot of permissions, and they cannot be secured. And the last advantage is this technology actually doesn't require you to install anything on these systems, which again is the main barrier for other technologies to work. I'll give you a quick example, and in this case, just a remote PowerShell session. This is just an example. The same thing is true for any other type of legacy protocol or system. And in this case, I'm going to show you how we are able to inject the Azure MFA. Okay, so we can use any MFA that the company is already using. This is not another MFA product that needs to be deployed. We connect to whatever existing MFA. Of course, in an air-gapped or an island mode environment, we'll be talking about probably a physical token and not something that goes out to the phone. But in this case, because it's just the same concept, I'll show you how this access can now be protected with the Azure MFA, okay, with the phone. This, of course, is only possible if you're in a network where you can talk to the internet. Otherwise, maybe a FIDO token or a one-time password are probably the best option. But what you could see here is how we were able to inject that MFA, no matter what it is, into a legacy interface. This could have been an HMI. This could have been an engineering workstation that you're trying to log into. This could have been many different types of things that exist in these kind of OT environments. Can't be protected right now. So how does it work? Right now, there are endpoints and servers and applications and devices in those networks that are using all kinds of protocols, mostly legacy protocols, which go to legacy authentication or identity platforms, things like Active Directory, Radius, or others. These solutions by themselves do not support modern authentication. They do not support multi-factor authentication or access control. They would just let anyone who has the password to log in. But we cannot get rid of them because they are the way that these systems currently work, and we don't want to change the systems, as we said. So instead of that, we sit behind them. So this new technology, this new architecture is based on sitting behind the legacy identity solution, inspecting all of these authentications, understanding when someone is trying to access a sensitive resource, and then triggering MFA, conditional access, whether it's in the cloud or whether it's on-prem within the air-gapped environment. Once we verify that, we simply tell the old legacy system that it can now grant access. So the nice thing about this architecture is the systems, the servers, the applications, the infrastructure, they still believe that they're using legacy authentication, password-based, as far as they know. They send an old authentication request and they receive a response. Nothing changed about that flow. So you don't need to install anything on them. You don't need to put a proxy in front of them. You don't need to modify them. But in fact, we are now sitting in the backend enforcing all these security controls. The last thing, just a few customer stories. I will actually not get into them. Anyone who's interested will be happy to follow up and tell you more. I don't want to make this too much about the actual stories. It was more about presenting a concept or a new architecture that I think is very important for companies in critical infrastructure to be aware of, because it actually addresses problems that couldn't be solved until now, as you can see in some of these stories. And now let's see if we have any questions. So anyone who has a question, feel free to write it in the Q&A section, and we'll be happy to answer. You can ask either myself or Stuart about anything you want. Okay, so one question: how do you actually protect service accounts? I assume it's for me, so I'll take that. So service accounts, again, non-human identities, they are especially difficult to protect in most situations because they cannot do multi-factor authentication. They are machines. They just don't have good thumbs, I guess, to press on the MFA. So what we do with them is a slightly different approach, more of a zero trust or a least privilege approach. We discover what they are doing. So they're connecting from these 5 sources to these 7 destinations, something like that. And once we figure that out, that pattern, that machine-like repetitive behavior, we can restrict them to only be able to do that. So we can say that from now on, this non-human identity cannot log in from anywhere else, and it cannot access anything else, or even use a different protocol or go out of the pattern of what it's normally doing. This means that these accounts will now only be able to do what they're intended to do. Even if somebody compromised them and they have a lot of permissions, they will not be able to actually cause damage. They will not be able to log in anywhere else. So there are a few parts here: the discovery of these accounts, building the baseline of what is that they're normally doing, and locking them down to that behavior, or at least sending an alert if they're going outside of this. Thank you for the question. Any other questions?
Sorry, I had to come off mute there. So I see a question basically saying, what's the priority of identity and access management in terms of critical national infrastructure? Strangely enough, this isn't this is not anything that's sort of particularly private, but stopping basic commodity attacks you could probably do without that identity. When I say basic commodity, I'm talking really basic commodity attacks. So it doesn't necessarily have that focus when it comes to identity systems. So just simple things like malware or anti-malware and that stuff. However, anything above the really, really basic, and which quite frankly, most attacks are now well above that level. And the only reason I mention these basic attacks is because, as I said, the OT world is 20 years behind the IT world. So you almost have to start from beginning. You know, let's get an antivirus on the HMI device and things like that. But anything that's remotely more sophisticated, anything like Colonial, which or an OT specific attack, you need to have identity systems. You need to have not only identity systems but also the monitoring of those identity systems as well. That becomes absolutely critical. And we're not talking about, but quite often I'm asked about state level attacks, and my response is, well, if a state wants to be hostile against us, that is another order of magnitude. I'm not trying to look to protect that. I'm trying to put sophisticated, but not a state level. There are other things to defend state, mutual destruction, and all sorts of other mechanisms that you start there. So I'm not trying to, keep the Russians out or keep the whoever out. Let's not try aim for there. Let's aim for the middle ground, and that's where identity systems become absolutely crucial.
Great. Another question came in the meanwhile, so I think it's for me. Can Silverfort stop ransomware attacks? So I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier. We don't stop the ransomware from getting into the network or into the first device. You need other products for that, right? No product can do it alone. So you'll need endpoint protection, email security, patching. But once you have ransomware on one of your computers, and that will unfortunately happen to many companies, we can prevent that ransomware from moving to any other computers or servers. We basically lock it down to the one device. We can basically stop the lateral movement or the propagation. The reason why that was considered impossible before is that multi-factor authentication, which should have been the solution, just doesn't work for the protocols that ransomware is using. So ransomware is not using the web interface or remote desktop to spread. It's using command line interfaces or SMB, things like that, old protocols that nobody can even see or protect. So the fact that Silverfort's technology can actually add MFA to these protocols means that we can challenge MFA when these protocols are being used to move between computers or between servers, meaning that the ransomware will just fail the MFA and it will not be able to move anywhere. This is something that we've actually seen on multiple customer environments where we actually stopped ransomware attacks. And I think it's really about that propagation, because without it, you just got one impact at the endpoint. And that's usually a smaller risk. Else, how will this impact day-to-day operations using PowerShell to update multiple machines? Will we need to whitelist anything? So this is a good question. It's really up to you. You can build a policy that is very, very clear, very strict. For example, anytime these users connect to these servers with PowerShell, you need MFA. In that case, the behavior is very expected. Yes, you need to tell these people that from now on, they will need to do MFA. But it's pretty simple. I think users at this point are used to MFA, even in a corporate environment. So this will just be one more scenario where they need to MFA. It is actually simpler than let's say a traditional vault or a proxy, because you can actually access the server directly. There's no impact to the way users access resources, so it's still direct. So actually a bit smoother. But you can also build policies that are a little less static. For example, you can say, whenever this legacy protocol is being used, I want MFA. Let's say NTLM v1. Whenever NTLM v1 is being used, I want MFA on top of it because it's a vulnerable protocol. That is something that you'll need to explain maybe a little better to your users. Still, it's not going to bother them in many situations, hopefully, because we're especially doing this for things that attackers would do. But this is something that will impact them in the cases where they do this risky thing. But that's the idea. When somebody's doing a risky thing, like using a legacy protocol, or maybe using a shared account, or maybe abusing a service account, like taking it and using it for its own purposes, these are things that you do want to require some extra verification for. So I think the balance on where do you bother user is all on you, and we have a customer success team that help you do it properly. Any other questions?
I've got one here that's just, I think it's probably addressed to me. What's the future of regulation in this space? Which is a great question. So the future of regulation, essentially, if nothing else changes, we are going to start to regulate, and this is down to Bayes in the UK, but it's very likely that we would regulate the suppliers as well. So the main suppliers to us, and start basically expecting them to supply secure systems or secure solutions, I should say. So we see that happening. In parallel to that, we would see the thresholds for energy now. We'll see the thresholds being reduced in terms of operators of essential services. So there would be a certain megawatts at the moment, but we'll reduce that. We also are expecting, as I said, aggregators and load balancers. And so for those that are not familiar with that, you've got to imagine that we'll be moving in a world whereby you can buy and sell energy as a household if you wanted to, and people can do that. But a lot of people won't want to do that. So they will have that obfuscated by a third party that will be buying and selling on your behalf, and helping you sort of manage that, and then sort of balance those systems, but effectively. So we see a rising set of load balancers and aggregators, and again that will be, I suspect, part of the regulation. So the regulation is going for sort of draft and consultation over the next few months, and sometime at the tail end of this year, beginning of next year, it will go through for approval.
Great. Someone just reminded me that I missed. I didn't answer part of the question we had before about having to whitelist things. If you access, let's say, a lot of machines with PowerShell, and do you need to whitelist anything? The great thing is that you actually don't, because the access from the endpoint to the servers is not impacted. It's not going through any proxy. It's direct. It's when the server is trying to verify those credentials that in the backend it is kind of being sent to Silverfort. So usually in most of the environments that we see, there's not much need, but there are cases, depending on what's your segmentation like, that we may need at some point in a firewall to open these connections between the existing identity infrastructure and Silverfort. Usually pretty straightforward. In any case, the access between the machines themselves and the resources is direct, is not impacted, and doesn't actually change. Do we have time for more questions?
I've got one for you, Ahed, if you've just going to throw one at you. What is the most challenging environment that you guys have implemented technology? Because I know that our environments here in the UK are incredibly challenging. So what's the most challenging environment?
Great question. So we've deployed this in some very large, very complex environments. One environment, for example, is at one of the biggest auto manufacturers in the world, with about 300,000 employees, multiple environments. So obviously, cloud environments, corporate environments, manufacturing environments, extremely complex. And in these environments, we saw basically anything. We saw a lot of machine-to-machine access, legacy systems, modern systems. Part of the idea was also to consolidate security across all of these, because they did have a solution for cloud identity, for example, but they had nothing for the legacy or the on-prem or the manufacturing environment. The idea was not to just build another silo over there, but to connect security across all these environments together, even though the environments are not directly connected. We were able to create an architecture where we can connect in the industrial network and in the corporate environment and in the cloud, and actually be able to consolidate security policies, even though these environments are separated. This was a very complex one. We also have some that were smaller, not in the hundreds of thousands of employees, even though we have several of those, but some that were just complex because of their nature. For example, we have places where we are deployed within oil and gas companies, for example, on actual oil rigs in the ocean, which I never thought we'll see. Or some companies where we are actually deploying the solution on ships. again, I was surprised that there's even enough infrastructure there to protect and to put our solution there, but I think these are kind of the ideal cases for us. Another very challenging scenario is when we work with defense companies, which are obviously kind of the extreme case of being very critical. A lot of that is air-gapped, so island mode, in a pretty extreme way, so there's really nothing that can go in and out. And we've actually had a story, and we have actually an anonymous case study on it on our website, where we stopped a nation-state attack within one of these networks. So a defense organization, very isolated environment, and we actually saw attackers within the network trying to move laterally. We were able to detect it in real time and block them from moving anywhere, and stopping this nation-state attack on a pretty big European defense organization. There was a case study in our website, anonymous, telling the full story with some actual details. So these are some examples of very complex environments.
So someone must have
specialized in those.
Right. So someone must have actually on that nation state attack, someone must have physically got in over the other side of the air gap and then gained access, right?
So I'll tell you the story because we're not talking about the name of the company, and this is something that they allowed us to share anonymously. They actually had another network that is not air gap being breached, and they were able to take a hold of a bunch of endpoints over there. Our solution was not actually deployed there, which obviously is not the case now. And they waited for people to come in to these networks, and apparently at some point, somebody connected a laptop within this environment. I mean, it will happen at some point, right? If you wait long enough. And at that point, attacks started moving within the network. It was very automated, so very little command and control that was needed. And that is something that we were able to detect. And by the way, protect multiple networks in this case, because this was just something that allows us to see that there are other networks that are also impacted. These are very interesting cases, but it only showed you that even nation-state attacks, they're using these same techniques that attackers are using, like lateral movement with stolen credentials. Why? Because it's easy, because it's available, because nobody can see it or stop it. So why won't you, right? Before started this company and before working in a couple of other companies, I was in 8200, the Israeli intelligence, doing cyber campaigns. So I also saw that from the other side. When you are trying to get into a network, no matter how sophisticated you are, these identity-based attacks are they're just there, and they're just easy. Because if you take credentials from an endpoint and you move using these legacy protocols, nobody could stop you. And we're trying to change that. But that was kind of the go-to approach for attackers, and I think it still is. So I think it's very important to address it. I think we're at time. Do you want to take any last questions, Stuart, or should we?
No, I think that's fine. We should respect people's time.
Perfect. So thank you very much, Stuart. I enjoyed the discussion, and I'm sure everyone here was really glad to hear your point of view. I really appreciate your time, agreeing to come here and talk with us, because I think this is important. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.